Welcome to Thueringer for Farming Simulator 15. We now continue with our Let's Read of My Antonia by Willa Cather in Book 1, Part 11. Grandmother hunted up her fancy cake cutters and baked gingerbread men and roosters, which we decorated with burnt sugar and red cinnamon drops. On the day before Christmas, Jake packed the things we were sending to the Chimeras in his saddlebags and set off on grandfather's gray gelding. When he mounted his horse at the door, I saw that he had a hatchet slung to his belt, and he gave grandmother a meaning look which told me he was planning a surprise for me. That afternoon, I watched long and eagerly from the sitting room window. At last, I saw a dark spot moving on the west hill beside the half-buried cornfield where the sky was taking on a coppery flush from the sun that did not quite break through. I put on my cap and ran out to meet Jake. When I got to the pond, I could see that he was bringing in a little cedar tree across his pommel. He used to help my father cut Christmas trees for me in Virginia, and he had not forgotten how much I liked them. By the time we had placed the cold, fresh-smelling little tree in a corner of the sitting room, it was already Christmas Eve. After supper, we all gathered there, and even grandfather, reading his paper by the table, looked up with a friendly interest now and then. The cedar was about 5 feet high and very shapely. We hung it with the gingerbread animals, strings of popcorn, and bits of candle, which Fuchs had fitted into pasteboard sockets. Its real splendors, however, came from the most unlikely place in the world, from Otto's cowboy trunk. I had never seen anything in that trunk but old boots and spurs and pistols and a fascinating mixture of yellow leather thongs, cartridges, and shoemaker's wax. From under the lining, he now produced a collection of brilliantly colored paper figures, several inches high and stiff enough to stand alone. They had been sent to him year after year by his old mother in Austria. There was a bleeding heart in tufts of paper lace. There were the 3 kings, gorgeously apparelled, and the ox and the ass and the shepherds. There was the baby in the manger, and a group of angels singing. There were camels and leopards, held by the black slaves of the 3 kings. Our tree became the talking tree of the fairy tale. Legends and stories nestled like birds in its branches. Grandmother said it reminded her of the tree of knowledge. We put sheets of cotton wool under it for a snowfield and Jake's pocket mirror for a frozen lake. I can see them now exactly as they looked, working about the table in the lamplight. Jake with his heavy features so rudely molded that his face seemed somehow unfinished. Otto with his half ear and the savage scar that made his upper lip curl so ferociously under his twisted mustache. As I remember them, what unprotected faces they were. Their very roughness and violence made them defenseless. These boys had no practiced manner behind which they could retreat and hold people at a distance. They had only their hard fists to batter at the world with. Otto was already one of those drifting, case-hardened laborers who never marry or have children of their own. Yet he was so fond of children. Part 12. On Christmas morning, when I got down to the kitchen, the men were just coming in from their morning chores. The horses and pigs always had their breakfast before we did. Jake and Otto shouted "Merry Christmas" to me and winked at each other when they saw the waffle irons on the stove. Grandfather came down wearing a white shirt and a Sunday coat. Morning prayers were longer than usual. He read the chapters from St. Matthew about the birth of Christ, and as we listened, it all seemed like something that had happened lately and near at hand. In his prayer, he thanked the Lord for the first Christmas and for all that it had meant to the world ever since. He gave thanks for our food and comfort and prayed for the poor and destitute in great cities where the struggle for life was harder than it was here with us. Grandfather's prayers were often very interesting. He had the gift of simple and moving expression. Because he talked so little, his words had a peculiar force. They were not worn dull from constant use. His prayers reflected what he was thinking about at the time, and it was chiefly through them that we got to know his feelings and his views about things. After we sat down to our waffles and sausage, Jake told us how pleased the Shimerdas had been with their presents. Even Ambrose was friendly and went to the creek with him to cut the Christmas tree. It was a soft gray day outside, with heavy clouds working across the sky and occasional squalls of snow. There were always odd jobs to be done about the barn on the holidays, and the men were busy until afternoon. Then Jake and I played dominoes while Otto wrote a long letter home to his mother. He always wrote to her on Christmas Day, he said, no matter where he was and no matter how long it had been since his last letter. All afternoon he sat in the dining room. He would write for a while, then sit idle, his clenched fist lying on the table, his eyes following the pattern of the oilcloth. He spoke and wrote his own language so seldom that it came to him awkwardly. His effort to remember entirely absorbed him. At about 4 o'clock, a visitor appeared. Mr. Shimerda, wearing his rabbit-skin cap and collar and new mittens his wife had knitted. He had come to thank us for the presents and for all grandmother's kindness to his family. Jake and Otto joined us from the basement, and we sat about the stove, enjoying the deepening gray of the winter afternoon and the atmosphere of comfort and security in my grandfather's house. This feeling seemed completely to take possession of Mr. Shimerda. I suppose in the crowded clutter of their cave, the old man had come to believe that peace and order had vanished from the earth, or existed only in the old world he had left so far behind. He sat still and passive, his head resting against the back of the wood rocking chair, his hands relaxed upon the arms. His face had a look of weariness and pleasure, like that of sick people when they feel relief from pain. Grandmother insisted on his drinking a glass of Virginia apple brandy after his long walk in the cold, and when a faint flush came up in his cheeks. His features might have been cut out of a shell, they were so transparent. He said almost nothing and smiled rarely, but as he rested there, we all had a sense of his utter content. As it grew dark, I asked whether I might light the Christmas tree before the lamp was brought. When the candle ends sent up their conical yellow flames, all the colored figures from Austria stood out clear and full of meaning against the green boughs. Mr. Shimerda rose, crossed himself, and quietly knelt down before the tree. His head sunk forward. His long body formed a letter S. I saw grandmother look apprehensively at grandfather. He was rather narrow in religious matters and sometimes spoke out and hurt people's feelings. There had been nothing strange about the tree before, but now, with someone kneeling before it, images, candles, grandfather merely put his fingertips to his brow and bowed his venerable head, thus proselytizing the atmosphere. We persuaded our guest to stay for supper with us. He needed little urging. As we sat down to the table, it occurred to me that he liked to look at us and that our faces were open books to him. When his deep-seeing eyes rested on me, I felt as if he were looking far ahead into the future for me, down the road I would have to travel. At 9 o'clock, Mr. Shimerda lighted one of our lanterns and put on his overcoat and fur collar. He stood in the little entry hall, the lantern and his fur cap under his arm, shaking hands with us. When he took grandmother's hand, he bent over it as he always did and said slowly, "Good woman." He made the sign of the cross over me, put on his cap, and went off in the dark. As we turned back to the sitting room, Grandfather looked at me searchingly. The prayers of all good people are good, he said quietly. Part 13. The week following Christmas brought in a thaw, and by New Year's Day all the world about us was a broth of gray slush, and the guttered slope between the windmill and the barn was running black water. The soft black earth stood out in patches along the roadsides. I resumed all my chores, carried in the cobs and wood and water, and spent the afternoons at the barn watching Jake shell corn with a hand sheller. One morning during this interval of fine weather, Antonia and her mother rode over on one of their shaggy old horses to pay us a visit. It was the first time Mrs. Shimerda had been to our house, and she ran about examining our carpets and curtains and furniture, all the while commenting upon them to her daughter in an envious, complaining tone. In the kitchen, she caught up an iron pot that stood on the back of the stove and said, "You got many. Shimerda's no got." I thought it weak-minded of grandmother to give the pot to her. After dinner, when she was helping to wash the dishes, she said, tossing her head, "You got many things for cook. If I got all things like you, I make much better." She was a conceited, boastful old thing, and even misfortune could not humble her. I was so annoyed that I felt coldly even towards Antonia, and listened unsympathetically when she told me her father was not well. "My papa sad for the old country. He not look good. He never make music any more. At home he play violin all the time, for weddings and for dance. Here never. When I beg him for play, he shake his head no. Some days he take his violin out of his box and make with his fingers on the strings, like this, but never he make the music. He don't like this country." "People who don't like this country ought to stay at home," I said severely. "We don't make them come here." "He not want to come, never," she burst out. "My mamienka make him come. All the time she say America big country. Much money, much land for my boys, with much husband for my girls. My papa he cry for leave his old friends, what make music with him. He love very much the man that play longhorn like this." She indicated a slide trombone. "They go to school together and they're friends from boys, but my mama she went Ambroge for be rich with many cattle." "Your mama," I said angrily, "wants other people's things." "Your grandfather is rich," she retorted fiercely. "Why he not help my papa? Ambroge be rich too, after while, and he pay back. He is very smart boy. For Ambroge my mama come here." Ambroge was considered the important person in the family. Mrs. Shimerda and Antonia always deferred to him, though he was often surly with them and contemptuous toward his father. Ambroge and his mother had everything their own way. Though Antonia loved her father more than she did anyone else, she stood in awe of her elder brother. After I watched Antonia and her mother go over the hill on their miserable horse, carrying our iron pot with them, I turned to grandmother, who had taken up her darning, and said, "I hope that snooping old woman wouldn't come to see us any more." Grandmother chuckled and drove her bright needle across a hole in Otto's sock. "She's not old, Jim, though I expect she seems old to you. No, I wouldn't mourn if she never came again. But you see, a body never knows what traits poverty might bring out in him. It makes a woman grasping to see her children want for things. Now, read me a chapter in The Prince of the House of David. Let's forget the Bohemians." We had 3 weeks of this mild, open weather. The cattle in the corral ate corn almost as fast as the men could shell it for them, and we hoped that it would be ready for an early market. One morning, the 2 big bulls, Gladstone and Brigham Young, thought spring had come, and they began to tease and butt at each other across the barbed wire that separated them. Soon they got angry. They bellowed and pawed up the soft earth with their hoofs, rolling their eyes and tossing their heads. Each withdrew to a far corner of his own corral, and then they made for each other at a gallop. Thud, thud, we could hear the impact of their great heads, and their bellowing shook the pans on the kitchen shelves. Had they not been dehorned, they would have torn each other to pieces. Pretty soon the fat steers took it up and began butting and horning each other. Clearly the affair had to be stopped. We all stood by and watched admiringly while Fuchs rode into the corral with a pitchfork and prodded the bulls again and again, finally driving them apart. The big storm of the winter began on my 11th birthday, the 20th of January. When I went down to breakfast that morning, Jake and Otto came in white as snowmen, beating their hands and stamping their feet. They began to laugh boisterously when they saw me, calling, "You've got a birthday present this time, Jim, and no mistake. They was a full-grown blizzard ordered for you." All day the storm went on. The snow did not fall this time. It simply spilled out of heaven like thousands of feather beds being emptied. That afternoon, the kitchen was a carpenter shop. The men brought in their tools and made two great wooden shovels with long handles. Neither grandmother nor I could go out in the storm, so Jake fed the chickens and brought in a pitiful contribution of eggs. Next day, our men had to shovel until noon to reach the barn, and the snow was still falling. There had not been such a storm in the 10 years my grandfather had lived in Nebraska. He said at dinner that we would not try to reach the cattle. They were fat enough to go without their corn for a day or two, but tomorrow we must feed them and thaw out their water tap so that they could drink. We could not so much as see the corrals, but we knew the steers were over there, huddled together under the north bank. Our ferocious bulls, subdued enough by this time, were probably warming each other's backs. "This'll take the bile out of 'em," Fuchs remarked gleefully. At noon that day, the hens had not been heard from. After dinner, Jake and Otto, their damp clothes now dried on them, stretched their stiff arms and plunged again into the drifts. They made a tunnel under the snow to the hen house with walls so solid that grandmother and I could walk back and forth in it. We found the chickens asleep. Perhaps they thought night had come to stay. One old rooster was stirring about, pecking at the solid lump of ice in their water tin. When we flashed the lantern in their eyes, the hens set up a great cackling and flew about clumsily, scattering down feathers. The mottled pin-headed guinea hens, always resentful of captivity, ran screeching out into the tunnel and tried to poke their ugly painted faces through the snow walls. By 5 o'clock, the chores were done, just when it was time to begin them all over again. That was a strange, unnatural sort of day. Part 14. On the morning of the 22nd, I awakened with a start. Before I opened my eyes, I seemed to know that something had happened. I heard excited voices in the kitchen. Grandmother's was so shrill that I knew she must be almost beside herself. I looked forward to any new crisis with delight. What could it be, I wondered as I hurried into my clothes. Perhaps the barn had burned. Perhaps the cattle had frozen to death. Perhaps a neighbor was lost in the storm. Down in the kitchen, grandfather was standing before the stove with his hands behind him. Jake and Otto had taken off their boots and were rubbing their woolen socks. Their clothes and boots were steaming, and they both looked exhausted. On the bench behind the stove lay a man covered with a blanket. Grandmother motioned me to the dining room. I obeyed reluctantly. I watched her as she came and went, carrying dishes. Her lips were tightly compressed, and she kept whispering to herself, "Oh, dear Savior, Lord, thou knowest." Presently, grandfather came in and spoke to me. "Jimmy, we will not have prayers this morning because we have a great deal to do. Old Mr. Shamirda is dead, and his family are in great distress. Ambrose came over here in the middle of the night, and Jake and Otto went back with him. The boys have had a hard night, and you must not bother them with questions. That is Ambrose asleep on the bench. Come into breakfast, boys. After Jake and Otto had swallowed their first cup of coffee, they began to talk excitedly, disregarding grandmother's warning glances. I held my tongue, but I listened with all my ears. No, sir, Fuchs said in answer to a question from grandfather. Nobody heard the gun go off. Ambrose was out with the ox team trying to break a road, and the women folks was shut up tight in their cave. When Ambrose came in, it was dark and he didn't see nothing, but the oxen acted kind of queer. One of 'em ripped around and got away from him, bolted clean out of the stable. His hands is blistered where the rope run through. He got a lantern and went back and found the old man, and just as we seen it. Poor soul, grandmother groaned. I'd like to think he never done it. He was always considerate and unwishful to give trouble. How could he forget himself and bring this on us? I don't think he was out of his head for a minute, Mrs. Burden, Fuchs declared. He done everything natural. You know he was always sort of fixy, and fixy he was to the last. He shaved after dinner and washed himself all over after the girls was done the dishes. Antonia heated the water for him, then he put on a clean shirt and clean socks, and after he was dressed he kissed her and the little one and took his gun and said he was going out to hunt rabbits. He must have gone right down to the barn and done it then. He laid down on that bunk bed close to the ox stalls where he always slept. When we found him, everything was decent except... Fuchs wrinkled his brow and hesitated. Except what he couldn't nowise foresee. His coat was hung on a peg and his boots was under his bed. He took off that silk neckcloth he always wore and folded it smooth and stuck his pen through it. He turned back his shirt at the neck and rolled up his sleeves. I don't see how he could do it, grandmother kept saying. Otto misunderstood her. Why, ma'am, it was simple enough. He pulled the trigger with his big toe. He laid over on his side and put the end of the barrel in his mouth, and then he drew up one foot and felt for the trigger. Oh, he found it all right. Maybe he did, said Jake grimly. There's something mighty queer about it. Now, what do you mean, Jake? Grandmother asked sharply. Well, ma'am, I found Groggy X's axe under the manger, and I picks it up and carries it over to the corpse. And I take my oath it just fit the gash in the front of the old man's face. At the air, Krajiak had been sneaking round, pale and quiet, and when he seen me examining the axe, he began whimpering, My God, man, don't do that. I reckon I'm a-going to look into this, says I. And he begun to squeal like a rat and run about wringing his hands. They'll hang me, says he. My God, they'll hang me sure. Fuchs spoke up impatiently. Krajiak X gone silly, Jake, and so have you. The old man wouldn't have made all them preparations for Krajiak to murder him, would he? It don't hang together. The gun was right beside him when Ambrose found him. Well, Krajiak could have put it there, couldn't he? Jake demanded. Grandmother broke in excitedly. See here, Jake Marpole, don't you go trying to add murder to suicide. We're in deep enough trouble here. Otto reads you too many of them detective stories. It will be easy to decide all that, Emmeline, said Grandfather quietly. If he shot himself in the way they think, the gash will be torn from the inside outward. Just so it is, Mr. Burden, Otto affirmed. I seen bunches of hair and stuff sticking to the poles and straw along the roof. They was blown up there by gunshot, no question. Grandmother told Grandfather she meant to go over to the Chimerdas with him. There is nothing you can do, he said doubtfully. The body can't be touched until we get the coroner here from Black Hawk, and that will be a matter of several days this weather. Well, I can take them some victuals anyway and say a word of comfort to them poor little girls. The oldest one was his darling and was like a right hand to him. He might have thought of her. He's just left her alone in a hard world. She glanced distrustfully at Ambrose, who was now eating his breakfast at the kitchen table. Fuchs, although he had been up in the cold nearly all night, was going to make the long ride to Blackhawk to fetch the priest and the coroner. On the gray gelding, our best horse, he would try to pick his way across the country with no roads to guide him. "Don't you worry about me, Mrs. Burden," he said cheerfully as he put on a second pair of socks. "I've got a good nose for directions, and I never did need much sleep. It's the gray I'm worried about. I'll save him what I can, but it'll strain him, as sure as I'm telling you. This is no time to be over-considerate of animals, Otto. Do the best you can for yourself. Stop at the Widow Stevens for dinner. She's a good woman, and she'll do well by you." After Fuchs rode away, I was left with Ambrose. I saw a side of him that I had not seen before. He was deeply, even slavishly devout. He did not say a word all morning, but sat with his rosary in his hands, praying, now silently, now aloud. He never looked away from his beads, nor lifted his hands except to cross himself. Several times a poor boy fell asleep where he sat, wakened with a start, and began to pray again. No wagon could be got to the Chimerdas until a road was broken, and that would be a day's job. Grandfather came from the barn on one of our big black horses, and Jake lifted grandmother up behind him. She wore her black hood and was bundled up in shawls. Grandfather tucked his bushy white beard inside his overcoat. They looked very biblical as they set off, I thought. Jake and Ambrose followed them, riding the other black and my pony, carrying bundles of clothes that we had got together for Mrs. Chimerda. I watched them go past the pond and over the hill by the drifted cornfield. Then, for the first time, I realized that I was alone in the house. I felt a considerable extension of power and authority, and was anxious to acquit myself creditably. I carried in cobs and wood from the long cellar, and filled both the stoves. I remembered that in the hurry and excitement of the morning, nobody had thought of the chickens, and the eggs had not been gathered. Going out through the tunnel, I gave the hens their corn, emptied the ice from their drinking pan, and filled it with water. After the cat had had his milk, I could think of nothing else to do, and I sat down to get warm. The quiet was delightful, and the ticking clock was the most pleasant of companions. I got Robinson Crusoe and tried to read, but his life on the island seemed dull compared with ours. Presently, as I looked with satisfaction about our comfortable sitting room, it flashed upon me that if Mr. Chimerda's soul were lingering about in this world at all, it would be here, in our house, which had been more to his liking than any other in the neighborhood. I remembered his contented face when he was with us on Christmas Day. If he could have lived with us, this terrible thing would never have happened. I knew it was homesickness that had killed Mr. Chimerda, and I wondered whether his released spirit would not eventually find its way back to its own country. I thought of how far it was to Chicago, and then to Virginia, to Baltimore, and then the great wintry ocean. No, he would not at once set out upon that long journey. Surely his exhausted spirit, so tired of cold and crowding and the struggle with the ever-falling snow, was resting now in this quiet house. I was not frightened, but I made no noise. I did not wish to disturb him. I went softly down to the kitchen, which, tucked away so snugly underground, always seemed to me the heart and center of the house. There on the bench behind the stove, I thought and thought about Mr. Chimerda. Outside, I could hear the wind singing over hundreds of miles of snow. It was as if I had let the old man in out of the tormenting winter and were sitting there with him. I went over all that Antonia had ever told me about his life before he came to this country, how he used to play the fiddle at weddings and dances. I thought about the friends he had mourned to leave, the trombone player, the great forest full of game. belonging, as Antonia said, to the nobles, from which she and her mother used to steal wood on moonlit nights. There was a white hart that lived in that forest, and if anyone killed it, he would be hanged, she said. Such vivid pictures came to me that they might have been Mr. Shimerda's memories, not yet faded out from the air in which they had haunted him. It had begun to grow dark when my household returned, and grandmother was so tired that she went at once to bed. Jake and I got supper, and while we were washing the dishes, he told me in loud whispers about the state of things over at the Shimerdas. Nobody could touch the body until the coroner came. If anyone did, something terrible would happen, apparently. The dead man was frozen through, just as stiff as a dressed turkey you hang out to freeze, Jake said. The horses and oxen would not go into the barn until he was frozen so hard that there was no longer any smell of blood. They were stabled there now with the dead man because there was no other place to keep them. A lighted lantern was kept hanging over Mr. Shimerda's head. Antonia and Ambrose and the mother took turns going down to pray beside him. The crazy boy went with him because he did not feel the cold. I believed he felt cold as much as anyone else, but he liked to be thought insensible to it. He was always coveting distinction. Poor Merrick.